A girl is lying in the ashes of a battlefield, alone. Everyone around her is dead. She should be dead too. She is not. And the man who kneels down beside her, the man who saves her life, the man who will spend the next several years of his life raising her like a daughter, is the same man responsible for killing everyone else on that battlefield. He does not know it yet, but he has just made the single most dangerous decision in the entire history of the Sith. Not because of what he is about to do to her, because of what she will one day do to everyone else. Her name will become Zannah, and what she grows up to become is not a warrior, not a conqueror, not some screaming, lightning-throwing monster who announces herself the moment she walks into a room. She becomes something far quieter, far harder to see coming. A Sith so patient, so completely hidden, that the people she destroys often never even realize they were destroyed by her at all. They just know afterward that they can no longer trust their own eyes, their own mind, their own memory of what actually happened to them. That is who Zannah becomes. That is the terror she builds her entire existence around. And it starts here, in the ashes, with a child nobody was even looking for. To understand exactly how dangerous that moment really was, you first have to understand what nearly wiped her out of existence before she ever had the chance to become anyone at all. There is a version of the Sith that people picture when they hear the word red blades, force lightning crackling between clenched fingers, a voice like grinding stone promising pain. That version is loud. That version wants to be seen, because being seen is how it wins. Zannah was never that version. She understood something almost none of the other Sith in this story ever did. Fear does not need a lightsaber. Fear does not need to raise its voice. Fear only needs to convince you that the thing standing in the shadow behind you is real, even when there is nothing there at all. Before she was Zannah, she did not exist as anyone history bothered to remember. She was a child with no family, no name that mattered, and no idea she had already been chosen for something far darker than survival. What makes her story unsettling is not that she became powerful. Plenty of Sith became powerful. What makes her story unsettling is how quietly it happened, how completely she was shaped without ever feeling the hand doing the shaping, and how, by the time she understood what she had become, she had already decided she liked it. This is the story of the girl who was found in the ashes of one apocalypse and grew up to design a very different kind of terror. Not the terror of destruction, the terror of not being able to trust your own mind to understand how she came to exist. You have to go back to the end of something enormous. For 1,000 years, the Sith had fought the Jedi in a war so long that entire generations were born, lived, and died, knowing nothing but conflict. This was the era historians would later call the New Sith Wars, a grinding, exhausting collapse of the old Sith Empire into infighting, splinter factions, and increasingly desperate ideology. By the final years of that war, the Sith were no longer a unified enemy. They were a mass of competing warlords bound loosely together under something calling itself the Brotherhood of Darkness, led by a Sith Lord named Khan, a man who preached a doctrine of equality among the dark side's followers. No single Sith would rule over the others, Khan insisted. They would all be strong together, all equally empowered, all bound in a shared purpose. It sounded, on the surface, like strength through unity. In practice, It diluted everything that had once made the Sith dangerous. When there is no hierarchy, there is no discipline. When every Sith believes themselves equal to every other, ambition stops being a weapon aimed outward at enemies and starts being a knife pointed sideways at your own allies. The Brotherhood of Darkness was not falling because the Jedi was stronger. It was falling because it had forgotten what it meant to be Sith in the first place. Among that crumbling brotherhood was a soldier who had risen through its ranks the hard way, without the benefit of noble blood or ancient bloodlines of dark side users behind him. His name, before all his names changed, was Dessel. He had clawed his way up from nothing, learned to survive in the meanest corners of the war, and eventually earned a place among the Sith, not through inherited privilege, but through sheer, brutal competence. And somewhere along that path, he stopped believing in Khan's vision of equality. He watched Sith Lords bicker and posture and undercut each other, while a disciplined, unified Jedi Order slowly ground the Brotherhood down. He came to a conclusion that would eventually reshape the entire future of the dark side of the Force. The Sith were not losing because there were too few of them. They were losing because there were too many. Too many egos, too many masters, too many people who called themselves powerful without the discipline to actually become powerful. What the Sith needed, he decided, was not strength in numbers. It was strength in scarcity. A single master, holding everything the dark side had to offer, refining it, hoarding it, protecting it from dilution. And a single apprentice, hungry enough, patient enough, and dangerous enough to eventually take it all by force. Only then would each generation of the dark side actually be stronger than the one before it. Instead of scattering its power across 100 competing egos who mostly just got in each other's way, he took a new name for himself as this philosophy hardened into conviction. He became Darth Bane, and he began quietly working to bring the entire Brotherhood of Darkness to its knees. Not because he wanted the Sith to lose the war, but because he wanted every single one of his rivals gone so that something smaller, sharper, and far more dangerous could rise from the wreckage. The end came on a planet called Ruusan, where the last significant Sith forces had been cornered by an overwhelming Jedi army after a string of defeats. Backed into a corner, desperate and encouraged in secret by Bane himself, the remaining Sith Lords turned to a weapon of last resort, an ancient and forbidden creation of Sith alchemy called a thought bomb. It was designed to unleash a wave of pure dark side annihilation, a detonation that would not simply kill bodies but would consume the life force and the very consciousness of every Force-sensitive being caught within its radius. Sith and Jedi alike, trapping their spirits in an endless, screaming torment rather than allowing them the mercy of death. Nearly 100 Sith Lords gathered in caverns beneath the planet's surface to combine their power and detonate it, believing it would be their final, devastating strike against the Jedi who had cornered them. Bane let them believe that. He had, in fact, quietly encouraged the plan, all while making absolutely certain that he himself would not be standing anywhere near the blast when it went off. When the thought bomb detonated, it did exactly what it was built to do. It obliterated the Brotherhood of Darkness in a single, catastrophic instant, tearing through the caverns and the battlefield above with a wave of dark side energy so total that it wiped out nearly every Sith and a significant portion of the Jedi army as well. The Jedi who survived looked at the devastation and believed, with total sincerity, that the Sith Order had finally been destroyed, extinguished. 1,000 years of war ended in a single afternoon. They declared victory. They began the long process of rebuilding a galaxy that had known nothing but conflict for as long as most of its inhabitants had been alive. And in the ashes of that battlefield, believing themselves triumphant, none of them noticed the one Sith who had survived, standing quietly at the edge of the destruction he had engineered, already looking past the smoke toward what came next. Bane walked that ruined battlefield alone in the aftermath, picking through the wreckage of his former order with something that was not quite grief and was not quite satisfaction either. It was closer to the cold calculation of an architect surveying a demolition site, already sketching the outline of what would be built in its place. And it was there, among the corpses and the still smoking craters left by the thought bomb, that he found something he had not expected to find. A child, alive, barely, but alive, in a place where nothing should have survived. She had no memory of how she had gotten there, no family looking for her, no name that anyone would ever trace back to a life before that battlefield. The record of her origin is thin and contradictory in the way that only truly obscure lives tend to be. But what is generally understood is that she had been little more than a girl caught in the wrong place at the worst possible moment in galactic history, likely meant for a very different fate entirely. Some accounts suggest she had been intended for the Jedi Order itself, a Force-sensitive child identified for training long before the chaos of Ruusan swallowed the plans anyone had for her. If that is true, then the war took her twice. Once, it stole away the life she might have had as a Jedi. And then, standing in the wreckage of that stolen life, the man responsible for the very carnage that orphaned her knelt down, looked at a half-conscious, half-forgotten little girl, and decided she was exactly what he needed. Her name, in what few records exist of that early life, was Rain. It would not stay her name for much longer, because Bane had no interest in raising a lost child out of kindness. He had a use for her. He simply intended to make sure she never realized that using her had come first, and caring for her, if he ever did care at all, had come only afterward, and only because it served the larger design. This is where the story starts to become genuinely unsettling, because what Bane did next was not simple villainy in the way audiences usually picture Sith villainy. He did not chain her up. He did not threaten her. He did not need to. He took her in, fed her, sheltered her, and over the years that followed, slowly, patiently, without ever revealing the true shape of what he was doing, he became the only stable presence in a child's entire world. Everyone she might have loved was dead. Everywhere she might have called home was gone. The only constant, the only source of safety, food, warmth, attention, and approval left in her universe was the man who had, in a very real sense, caused the catastrophe that took everything else away from her. She never knew that. She could not have known that. And so, without a single act of overt cruelty, Bane secured something far more valuable than obedience. He secured trust. Genuine, deeply rooted, formative trust, built during the exact years of a child's life, when a person's entire understanding of safety and love is being constructed, brick by brick, around whoever happens to be standing closest. He was, in every sense that mattered to a small girl with no other frame of reference, her father. And fathers, even monstrous ones, even ones with an agenda 1,000 years in the making, are very hard to see clearly when you are the child standing inside that relationship. This is the part of Zannah's origin that tends to get flattened into a single sentence in most retellings. Bane found an orphan and trained her as his apprentice. But sit with what that actually means. A man who had just orchestrated the annihilation of an entire order, who had watched nearly 100 former comrades incinerated in a weapon he himself had encouraged them to use, picked up a traumatized, parentless child from the wreckage of that same event and spent years quietly, deliberately, patiently building her into a weapon aimed at everyone who might ever threaten his new philosophy of Sith power. And he did it so gently, so gradually, that she would grow into adulthood, believing the relationship between them was something closer to family than to manufacture. The training did not begin as anything resembling Sith indoctrination, at least not openly. In the earliest years, it looked more like survival, more like discipline, more like the kind of harsh but purposeful upbringing that might shape any exceptionally gifted, exceptionally isolated child under the care of an exacting guardian. Bane taught her to fight before he taught her anything about the Force at all, because he understood something fundamental about power that many Sith before him had missed. Raw strength without discipline is just a tantrum with a weapon attached to it. He wanted her disciplined first, dangerous second, physical conditioning, combat instinct, patience, control over her own impulses. All of it came before he ever let her touch the deeper, darker currents of what she was capable of. And as she grew, as her body and her mind matured together under his watchful, calculating attention, he began introducing her to the truth of what he actually was and what he intended her to become. Not all at once. Never all at once. He was far too careful, an architect for that. He revealed the philosophy of the Sith to her in pieces, shaping her understanding the same way he had shaped her sense of safety, one deliberate exposure at a time, always at the moment she was most ready to receive it. Never before. By the time she fully understood that her guardian was a Dark Lord of the Sith, and that he intended to make her one as well, the idea did not horrify her. It felt inevitable. It felt like coming home to something she had always half known about herself. That is, in many ways, the most disturbing part of how Bane built her. He did not convert her to the dark side. He raised her inside it so completely that she never experienced a moment of conversion at all. There was no fall, because there was never a height for her to fall from. There was only ever the floor Bane had built beneath her, and she grew up standing on it, believing it was simply the ground. What set Zannah apart from almost every Sith who came before her, and a great many who came after, was where her true gift actually lay. She was a capable duelist. Certainly, she would go on to master a double-bladed lightsaber and use it with a precision that made her a genuine physical threat to anyone who faced her directly. But blades and raw force power were never where her real talent lived. Her real talent, the thing that made Bane look at her with something close to fascination even in her earliest years of training, was her instinctive, almost effortless command of Sith sorcery, particularly the darker, subtler arts of illusion. Where most Sith reached for lightning, for choking grips, for the blunt instruments of fear built on physical pain, Zannah reached instead for something far harder to defend against. She learned to reach directly into a person's mind and construct things there that were not real but felt real. Felt more real than anything the victim's own senses could offer. As a counter-argument, nightmares given shape. Phantoms conjured from a target's own deepest anxieties and turned loose inside their skull like weapons built from their own psychology. Bain taught her some of this deliberately, but a significant part of it seemed to emerge from something innate in her, an aptitude that even he, for all his study of ancient Sith knowledge, could not fully explain or replicate himself. He had built her discipline. He had built her loyalty. But the true horror she would eventually become capable of inflicting on other people was something closer to a native language for her. One she was simply better at speaking than almost anyone else in galactic history. Consider what that actually means for a moment, because it is worth sitting with rather than rushing past. A lightsaber threatens your body. Force, lightning, threatens your body. Even the raw, brute intimidation of a Sith Lord looming over you with the dark side radiating off them like heat threatens something you can at least identify and brace against. Because you know, on some level, that the danger is external. It is a thing happening to you, from outside of you. What Zannah eventually learned to do was different, in a way that strikes at something much more fundamental to a person's sense of self. She could make you see things that were not there, hear voices that did not exist, feel the cold grip of a hand closing around your throat when no hand was anywhere near you. And the true cruelty of it was not simply the fear those illusions produced in the moment. It was the slower, creeping horror of realizing afterward that you could no longer fully trust your own senses. If she could make you see a monster that was not real, how would you ever be entirely certain the next time something frightened you, whether it was real or not? She did not just attack people. She corrupted the one tool every sentient being relies on more than any other to survive: their own perception of reality. And once that tool is compromised, once a person has genuinely experienced their own mind turning against them, a particular kind of fear settles in that never fully goes away. That is the terror Zannah specialized in, not the terror of dying. The terror of not being able to trust that anything you experience is actually happening. Bain recognized very early what he had in her, and he adjusted his long game accordingly. His original vision for the Sith's return from the shadows had always centered on patience, on infiltration, on corrupting the Republic and eventually the Jedi Order itself from within rather than confronting either in open war the way the old Sith Empire always had, and always lost. Open war got the Brotherhood of Darkness annihilated by a thought bomb of its own making. Bain had no intention of repeating that mistake. His new Sith would not announce themselves. They would not build armies or conquer worlds with fleets. They would work in shadow, generation after generation, quietly accumulating knowledge, quietly positioning themselves near the levers of galactic power, quietly waiting for the moment, centuries away if necessary, when the Republic and the Jedi would be weak enough, distracted enough, or corrupted enough from within that a single, perfectly prepared Sith Lord could bring the whole structure down with a single, decisive strike. A weapon like Zannah's illusions fit that long, patient strategy far better than open confrontation ever could. You cannot fight an enemy you cannot identify. You cannot defend against a threat that attacks your perception of reality itself, rather than your body. Bain began to understand that his apprentice was not simply going to be dangerous in a duel. She was going to be capable of unraveling people from the inside. of infiltrating minds the way a spy infiltrates a fortress, leaving her targets doubting their own sanity. Long before they ever understood they had been targeted at all. Years passed this way, in isolation, in relentless training, in a bond between master and apprentice that was genuinely close in a way that most retellings of Sith history rarely emphasize. This was not simply cruelty stacked upon cruelty. There were, by most accounts, real moments of warmth between them, real pride on Bane's part, as he watched his apprentice grow into something formidable, real affection, twisted as it inevitably was by everything underlying it. In the years they spent together crossing the galaxy while remaining almost entirely unknown to the wider Republic, and the Jedi who believed the Sith extinct, that warmth is part of what makes the eventual trajectory of their relationship so unsettling rather than simply tragic. Bane was not training a weapon he felt nothing for. He loved her. In whatever damaged, possessive, conditional way a man built entirely around ambition and control was capable of loving anyone. And she loved him back, genuinely, as the only family she had ever known. And underneath every single moment of that affection, both of them understood, because Bane had made absolutely certain she understood, that the entire relationship was built on borrowed time. The rule of two he had created was not a suggestion. It was not a phase either of them would eventually outgrow into some gentler arrangement. It was a law written into the very philosophy that defined what they were to each other. A master to embody power, an apprentice to crave it, to grow strong enough to take that power by force, and eventually, inevitably, to kill the only parent she had ever known, in order to become everything he had spent her entire childhood shaping her to be. That is the quiet horror sitting underneath every training session, every shared meal, every moment of pride Bane allowed himself to feel watching her grow stronger. He was not simply raising a daughter, he was raising his own murderer, on purpose, by design, and calling it love the entire time. It would be easy to assume that a child raised this way, groomed from the ashes of a genocide to eventually kill the man who raised her, might have resented the arrangement, or resisted it, or at the very least felt some private horror at what she was being prepared to eventually do. What makes Zannah such a genuinely disquieting figure in Sith history is that she does not appear to have felt that horror at all, not in any way the surviving accounts of her life suggest. She accepted the rule of two the same way she accepted everything else Bane taught her, as simply the shape of the world she lived in. Of course, the apprentice eventually kills the master. That was not cruelty to her. That was structure. That was the natural order of the only life she had ever known. No more emotionally fraught to her on some fundamental level than accepting that night follows day. If anything, as her training progressed and her power grew, what began to stir in her was not dread at the thought of eventually confronting her master, but a kind of restless, hungry anticipation. The same ambition Bane had spent years deliberately cultivating in her, finally beginning to look, for the first time, toward its ultimate and inevitable target. She was being raised to want to kill him, and by the time she was old enough to fully understand what that meant, she did want it, in the same quiet, patient, calculating way. She wanted everything else, not out of hatred, out of design, because that is what she had been built. From the very first moment Bane knelt beside her in the ashes of Ruusan, to eventually become Before that confrontation could ever arrive, however, Bane had other uses for her. Tests he needed her to pass, and one in particular that would reveal, in full, exactly what kind of Sith his apprentice had become. It centered on a Jedi named Set Hearth, and it stands as one of the clearest demonstrations in all of Sith history of just how effective Zannah's particular gift for psychological ruin actually was when turned loose on a real, living target rather than practiced in the abstract. Set Hearth was, by most measures, a competent and reasonably respected member of the Jedi Order. A man who believed, as every Jedi of his era believed, that the Sith were an extinct threat, a horror story from the galaxy's violent past, rather than a living danger still operating in the present. That belief was exactly the vulnerability Bane's entire strategy had been built around exploiting. And Zannah was the instrument he chose to exploit it. The plan called for her to approach Set Hearth not as an enemy, but as something far more dangerous to a man in his position. A confidant, a sympathetic presence, someone who seemed to understand him, to see him clearly, in ways the rigid structure of the Jedi Order itself often failed to. She did not announce herself as a threat, because announcing herself as a threat would have accomplished nothing. Threats put people on guard. What she wanted was the opposite. She wanted Set Hearth to lower every single defense he had, to let her close enough that when she finally struck, there would be no wall left standing between her and the deepest, most private corners of his mind. What followed was a masterclass in exactly the kind of manipulation Bane had spent years training her to perform. She studied Set Hearth the way a predator studies the specific weaknesses of a specific prey animal, not generically, not with some broad understanding of Jedi psychology, but with a patient, individualized attention to exactly what made this particular man tick, what he feared, what he doubted about himself in the private, unspoken corners of his own conscience, what he wanted that the rigid discipline of the Jedi Order had taught him to suppress. Every Jedi carries some version of that suppressed want, some quiet human need buried beneath decades of training in detachment and duty. And Zannah's genius, if that is even the right word for something this calculated, was in locating exactly where those buried wants lived in Set Hearth, and then, slowly, patiently, without ever revealing her hand, giving him small, quiet permission to acknowledge them. She did not need to convert him to the dark side through force or intimidation. She simply needed to become the one presence in his life who seemed to understand the parts of himself the Jedi Order had spent his entire career teaching him to bury. That is often how the most effective corruption actually works. Not through grand temptation, but through the slow, patient granting of permission to feel things. A person has spent years telling themselves they are not allowed to feel. As the relationship between them deepened, Zannah began layering in the illusions that were her true specialty. And this is where the manipulation shifted from something psychologically sophisticated into something genuinely, viscerally terrifying for the man on the receiving end of it. She did not simply talk to Set Hearth. She began reaching into his mind directly, constructing experiences for him that felt entirely real in the moment, then vanished, leaving him increasingly uncertain about what he had actually witnessed and what his own mind had somehow invented. Imagine believing you have seen something horrifying, something that shakes you to your core, only to look again and find nothing there at all. Now imagine that happening not once, but repeatedly. Each incident chipping away a little more at your confidence in your own perception, until you can no longer tell whether the danger around you is real or whether you have simply started losing your grip on reality itself. That is precisely the state Zannah cultivated in Set Hearth. Methodically, deliberately, over an extended period of exposure to a mind far more practiced in the art of psychological warfare than his own. A lesser target might have broken immediately. Set Hearth held on longer than most, which only made the eventual collapse more complete when it finally came, because by the time his mind gave way entirely, there was very little left of his own judgment for him to fall back on. He had spent so long doubting his own senses that when Zannah finally offered him a version of reality that felt stable, coherent, and reassuring, even if that version served her purposes entirely rather than his, he had no defenses left with which to question it. The specific details of how far Set Hearth's unraveling went, and what use Bane and Zannah ultimately made of him once he was thoroughly compromised, are murkier in the surviving record than the broad shape of the manipulation itself. But the broad shape is more than enough to understand exactly what kind of weapon Bane had finished building in his apprentice. A Jedi, trained from childhood to sense danger, to detect manipulation, to remain centered and calm under the kind of pressure that would break an ordinary person, had been dismantled from the inside by a young woman who never needed to raise a lightsaber against him at all. She did not defeat him in combat. She defeated the part of him that made combat or resistance or clear thinking of any kind possible in the first place. And she did it not as some final, climactic display of overwhelming Sith power, but as a controlled, patient exercise, almost a training assignment set for her by Bane, a test to confirm that everything he had spent years cultivating in her had taken root exactly the way he intended. She passed that test completely, and in passing it, she confirmed something that should unsettle anyone who studies Sith history closely. The most dangerous weapon the dark side ever produced during this era was not a blade. It was not lightning. It was a mind capable of convincing you that your own mind could no longer be trusted, wielded by someone who had been quietly, patiently built for exactly that purpose since she was found, half-conscious and entirely alone, in the wreckage of a battlefield that was supposed to have ended the Sith forever. By the time the Set Hearth affair had run its course, Bane understood that his apprentice had grown into something formidable in her own right, no longer simply a student absorbing his teachings, but an independent and increasingly capable practitioner of the dark side. With instincts even he could not always predict or fully account for. That realization should have been a source of pride for him, and in many ways it was. But somewhere beneath that pride, if the surviving fragments of their history are read carefully, something else had begun to take root as well. A quiet unease. The same unease, perhaps, that every Sith master under the rule of two eventually has to face. The slow, dawning recognition that the very apprentice you have spent years making stronger is, by the unbreakable logic of the philosophy you yourself created, being made stronger specifically so that she can one day end you. Bane had built that inevitability into the rule of two with his eyes open, understanding intellectually that it would apply to him just as surely as it would apply to every master who came after him. Understanding it intellectually, however, and feeling its approach as a living, breathing reality standing across the room from you, watching you with eyes that have finally grown sharp enough to see every weakness you have left, are two very different things. And what neither of them yet fully knew in the years immediately following the ruin of Set Hearth was that Zannah had already begun quietly preparing for that eventual confrontation in a way that went far beyond simply growing stronger under her master's instruction. She had begun, in secret, cultivating something Bane himself had not authorized and did not yet know existed, an apprentice of her own, being shaped in the shadows the exact same way she herself had once been shaped, long before her master ever noticed what she was building behind his back. The woman she found was an Iktochi, a species known throughout the galaxy for a limited but genuine precognitive sense, a faint ability to feel the shape of coming danger before it fully arrived. She worked. At the time Zannah first crossed her path, as a bounty hunter and assassin, a woman already comfortable with violence, already skilled at tracking a target across a hostile galaxy and closing the distance without being seen until it was far too late for the target to do anything about it. That skill set alone would have made her useful to Zannah. What made her genuinely valuable was something rarer, a capacity for absolute, unquestioning devotion once her loyalty had been earned, combined with an instinctive understanding of hierarchy that meshed almost perfectly with the philosophy Zannah had been raised inside since childhood, where Zannah's own gift was illusion, misdirection, the slow unraveling of a mind from the inside. This woman's gift was pursuit, patience, and an almost predatory stillness, the ability to wait, unnoticed, for exactly the right moment to strike. Together, master and secret apprentice would eventually make one of the more effective duos in Sith history. But in those early years, none of that had been built yet. There was only Zannah, watching a talented, hungry, and quietly displaced woman from a distance, recognizing in her the same rootlessness that had once defined a child called Rain, standing alone in the wreckage of Ruusan, and deciding, with the same cold, patient calculation Bane had once shown toward her, that here was potential worth claiming before anyone else claimed it first. What makes this particular decision so revealing about who Zannah had actually become by this point in her life is not simply that she recruited an apprentice. It is that she did it in direct, deliberate violation of the very philosophy her entire existence had been built around. The rule of two was absolute. Two Sith, no more. A master and an apprentice, nothing else, nothing in between. Because anything in between reintroduced exactly the kind of dilution and competing ambition that had destroyed the old Sith Empire and gotten the entire Brotherhood of Darkness annihilated in a single afternoon on Ruusan. Bane had built his whole vision of the future around the discipline of that scarcity, and his own apprentice, the one he had raised from infancy, specifically to embody that discipline more completely than any Sith who came before her, was quietly breaking the rule behind his back before she had even killed him and formally claimed the title of master for herself. There is a particular kind of coldness required to do something like that. A willingness to look at the foundational law of your entire belief system and decide, privately, that it applies to everyone except you, that your own survival and your own advantage matter more than the philosophy you have spent your whole life being told is sacred. Zannah did not agonize over that decision the way a more conflicted student of Bane's teachings might have. She simply made it, quietly, patiently, the same way she made every other calculated move in her life, because she understood something Bane himself may never have fully admitted even to himself. The rule of two was not actually a sacred, unbreakable law of the universe. It was a strategy, A very effective strategy, but a strategy nonetheless created by one ambitious, calculating man to solve a specific problem at a specific moment in Sith history. And strategies, unlike laws of physics, can be adjusted the instant someone with enough nerve decides adjusting them serves their interests better than following them blindly ever could. She named her secret apprentice Darth Cognus, though the title would not become fully official, would not be formally, permanently bestowed until Zannah had completed the one act still standing between her and the mastery that would let her claim it. She made Cognus a promise instead, one that mirrored, in its structure, the exact promise Bane had implicitly made to her across all the years of her own training. Serve faithfully, grow strong, wait. And when the moment finally comes, when the current master has been dealt with and the title of Dark Lord of the Sith has passed to new hands, everything that promise implies will finally, formally belong to you. It is worth pausing on how strange and how cold that arrangement actually is, once you look at it clearly. Zannah was, in effect, training a second version of herself, a woman who would eventually inherit everything Zannah was about to inherit from Bane, and who was, by the exact same unbreakable logic of the rule of two, being quietly prepared from the very beginning to eventually kill Zannah as well. The moment the roles reversed and the apprentice finally grew hungry enough to challenge the master who made her. Zannah understood this. She had lived inside that exact dynamic her entire life, and she built a second version of it anyway, deliberately, with open eyes, because somewhere in the calculating architecture of her mind, the value of having a devoted weapon at her side outweighed the eventual, inevitable cost of that weapon someday turning on her. That is not the thinking of someone who fears death, or fears betrayal, or fears the slow, grinding machinery of the philosophy she was raised inside. It is the thinking of someone who has made complete, total peace with all three, who has decided that being consumed eventually by the same system that consumed everyone before her is simply the price of admission for the power she intends to hold in the meantime, and who considers that price entirely worth paying. While all of this unfolded quietly, hidden even from Bane, the relationship between master and apprentice was entering its final, most fragile phase, and the shift in its texture had almost nothing to do with Cognus at all. It had to do with something stirring inside Bane himself, a fear that had been sitting dormant beneath the surface of his philosophy for years and was finally beginning to surface as his own strength inevitably began to show the first faint signs of decline. The rule of two carried within it a flaw Bane had recognized from the very beginning, but had never quite figured out how to solve. And as the years wore on, and his own body and force abilities began, the slow, unavoidable process every living creature eventually goes through, that flaw stopped being a distant, theoretical problem and became a very immediate, very personal one. What happens? He began to ask himself with increasing urgency. If the apprentice never comes, what happens if the master grows old, grows weak, grows vulnerable to death or disease or simple bad luck, long before the apprentice has proven strong enough or willing enough to strike? The entire lineage he had built the rule of two to protect, the entire unbroken chain of increasingly powerful Sith masters he had envisioned, stretching forward for 1,000 years, would simply end, snap, a single broken link, and everything he had sacrificed to build everything he had shaped a lost, orphaned child into becoming would collapse into nothing, the same way the old Sith Empire had collapsed into nothing on Ruusan, just through a different mechanism of failure. That fear did not manifest as weakness in Bane. It manifested instead as obsession, a growing, consuming fixation on a subject that ancient Sith texts hinted at only in fragments and rumors across the centuries. A subject that promised, if the rumors held even a grain of truth, to solve his fear permanently and completely. Immortality. Not metaphorical immortality through legacy or teaching or the continuation of a philosophy passed down through generations, but literal, physical immortality, a way for a Sith Lord to escape the one enemy that neither lightsaber nor lightning nor the darkest sorcery Zannah had ever conjured could ever be turned against. Death itself. Bane began pouring his attention into ancient records of Sith alchemy, into half-remembered legends of dark side practitioners who had supposedly found ways to extend their lives far beyond what any living creature should naturally be capable of, into the kind of forbidden, dangerous knowledge that even most Sith considered too unstable and too costly to pursue. And as he poured himself deeper into that obsession, something subtle but unmistakable began to shift in how he treated the apprentice standing beside him. He grew more secretive, more withdrawn, more prone to leaving her behind for long stretches while he pursued leads and legends across the galaxy alone, unwilling, for reasons he did not fully explain, even to her, to let her see exactly how far his search for immortality had progressed, or exactly how desperate that search had actually become. Zannah noticed. Of course she noticed. She had spent her entire life being trained to notice exactly this kind of shift. The subtle tells of a mind under strain. The small inconsistencies between what a person says and what their behavior actually reveals about what they are truly thinking and feeling underneath. And what she began to see, watching her master retreat further and further into his obsession, disturbed her in a way that very little else in her carefully controlled life had ever managed to. Not because she feared for his safety, though there was likely some genuine residue of that old, complicated childhood affection buried somewhere in her reaction. What disturbed her was the implication underneath the obsession itself. If Bane succeeded in finding true immortality, if he actually discovered a way to cheat death permanently, what exactly did that mean for her? The entire structure of her existence, the entire purpose she had been raised and shaped and trained to eventually fulfill, was built around a single, inevitable transition of power from master to apprentice. An immortal master had no need of that transition. An immortal master had no need, eventually, of an apprentice at all, except perhaps as a tool to be used and discarded, rather than a successor to be handed the full weight of everything he had built. She began to wonder, quietly, carefully, never voicing the thought aloud, where he might sense it, forming in her mind, whether the man who had raised her, trained her, and shaped every single aspect of who she had become, was now searching for a way to make sure she never got to claim the inheritance he had spent her entire life preparing her to eventually take from him. That suspicion did not arrive all at once, in a single dramatic confrontation or a single moment of clarity. It accumulated slowly, the way most genuine fear does, built from small observations, stacked one on top of another, until the total weight of them became impossible to keep ignoring. A private conversation cut short the instant she entered the room. A holocron he quickly concealed rather than sharing its contents with her, the way he had shared nearly every other piece of Sith knowledge across the years of her training. A trip he took alone, with no explanation offered and none requested, because by this point in their relationship, asking too many questions about where his obsession was taking him had become its own quiet risk. She had been trained, after all, by the single most patient, most calculating strategist the Sith had produced in centuries, a man who had spent an entire war manipulating events from the shadows without a single one of his enemies. Suspecting his hand was on the scale. If anyone in the galaxy understood how dangerous it was to underestimate what Darth Bane might be planning, it was the apprentice who had spent her whole life learning to think exactly the way he thought. And so, somewhere in the quiet, mounting unease of watching her master chase immortality further and further from her side, Zannah stopped waiting for the natural, patient unfolding of the Rule of Two to eventually run its course on its own timeline. She began, instead, to consider the possibility that time itself was the one resource she could no longer afford to spend carelessly. If Bane found what he was searching for before she was ready to move against him, the future she had been built for her entire life might simply cease to exist, replaced by something far worse. A permanent master, an eternal subordination. A life spent forever as the apprentice, never the Dark Lord. Serving a man who had found a way to make sure the throne she had been raised to inherit would never actually become vacant. It is worth stepping back here, before this story moves any further, to really sit with why Zannah unsettles people who study Sith history far more than most of the far flashier, far more violent Dark Lords who came before and after her. Darth Bane burned an order to the ground and rebuilt the entire philosophy of the Sith around scarcity and discipline, and that is a genuinely staggering, world-altering act. But it is also, in its own way, a legible one. You can trace the logic. You can point to the ambition, the ruthlessness, the strategic brilliance, and understand, even if you find it monstrous, exactly what drove him to do it and exactly what he hoped to gain. Zannah is harder to read that way, and that difficulty is precisely what makes her so quietly disturbing. She was not driven by some grand, articulable vision of galactic domination the way Bane was, or by the raw hunger for vengeance that defined so many Sith who came before the Rule of Two ever existed. She was driven by something colder and, in its own way, more alien to ordinary human motivation. She simply wanted to become the most complete version of what she had been built to be. And she pursued that goal with a patience and a total absence of hesitation that very few beings, Sith or otherwise, have ever managed to sustain across an entire lifetime. She did not hate Bane. She did not resent her circumstances. She did not rage against the unfairness of a life built entirely around her own eventual usefulness. She simply accepted the shape of the world she had been placed inside, understood exactly what that world required of her, and set about fulfilling those requirements with a discipline that looked, from the outside, almost serene. There is something genuinely chilling about serenity in a person being trained their entire life to become a murderer, because it suggests an absence of the very friction most of us rely on, consciously or not, to reassure ourselves that other people share our basic moral instinct. Zannah did not need to overcome guilt or doubt or fear in order to do what she eventually did, because those things had never really taken root in her. in the first place. Bane had raised her too completely, too skillfully, for any of that ordinary human resistance to survive the process. Think, too, about what her chosen weapon actually says about her, as opposed to what a more conventional Sith's weapon of choice might say. A Sith Lord who reaches instinctively for lightning, for brute force power, for the kind of overwhelming physical dominance that leaves no ambiguity about who holds the advantage in a confrontation, is revealing something about how they see strength itself. Strength, to that kind of Sith, is visible. It is loud. It announces itself, because the entire point of wielding it is to be recognized as powerful, to be feared openly, to stand over an opponent and watch them understand, in that moment, exactly how outmatched they are. Zannah's gift ran in the opposite direction entirely. Illusion does not announce itself. Illusion works precisely because it hides, because the target never realizes, until it is far too late, that anything has been done to them at all. A Sith who prefers illusion to lightning is a Sith who has thought carefully about what actually constitutes power, and has concluded that visible dominance is, in many ways, a weaker and less efficient tool than invisible control. Why force someone to submit through fear of your open strength, when you can simply reshape what they believe to be true and let them walk willingly, even gratefully, into exactly the outcome you intended for them the entire time? That is a philosophy of power built around patience and precision rather than spectacle, and it maps almost perfectly onto everything else we know about how Zannah was raised, trained, and shaped across the years of her childhood and adolescence under Bane's careful, calculating guidance. She was never taught to want to be seen as powerful. She was taught to want to actually be powerful, in the quiet, structural sense that matters far more in the long run than any dramatic, momentary display of dominance ever could. The galaxy at large never even knew the Sith still existed during this entire era. That invisibility was not an accident or a limitation Zannah and Bane simply tolerated. It was the entire point. And Zannah, more than almost any other Sith in this lineage, seemed to understand instinctively why that kind of quiet, unseen influence was worth more than any throne built on open conquest ever could be. There is also something worth examining in how deliberately isolated Zannah's entire upbringing was, because isolation of that kind does something specific and lasting to a developing mind, something that goes well beyond simply making a person more obedient to whoever happens to be raising them. A child raised among other children, among a wider community, among adults with competing perspectives and competing values, absorbs, almost by osmosis, a range of different ideas about what is normal, what is acceptable, and what crosses a line worth resisting. That range of competing input is part of what allows most people to eventually develop an internal moral compass that is at least partially independent of any single authority figure's influence. Zannah had none of that. From the moment Bane found her in the wreckage of Ruusan, her entire world narrowed down to a single source of information, a single source of approval, a single source of safety, and a single, unchallenged framework for understanding what power, loyalty, and family actually meant. There was no wider community to offer a competing perspective. There was no second adult in the room to quietly suggest that perhaps not everything her master told her about the nature of strength and weakness was entirely true. She grew up inside an echo chamber built and maintained by one of the most brilliant, most patient manipulators the galaxy has ever produced. And echo chambers of that kind sustained across an entire childhood, do not simply influence a person's beliefs. They construct the very architecture the person eventually uses to evaluate every belief they will ever hold for the rest of their life. By the time Zannah was old enough to potentially question anything Bain had taught her, she no longer possessed the independent framework that questioning would have required. The tools she might have used to critically examine her upbringing had themselves been built, piece by piece, by the very person whose teachings those tools would have needed to examine. That is not simply effective indoctrination. That is something closer to a perfectly closed loop, a system engineered so completely that the person trapped inside it can never fully step outside its boundaries long enough to see the walls at all. And this, perhaps more than the lightsaber duels or the illusions or even the eventual betrayal still waiting further down this story, is the piece of Zannah's history that deserves to sit uncomfortably with anyone paying close attention. Because the truly frightening thing about her was never really that she became a monster. Plenty of beings across galactic history have become monsters through trauma, through rage, through desperate circumstance, twisting something that might otherwise have grown into decency, into something bitter and violent instead. Zannah's path was different, and, in its own way, far more disturbing to sit with, because nothing about her transformation required trauma to twist her after the fact. She was constructed as a monster from the very beginning, deliberately, patiently, by someone who understood exactly what he was building and exactly how to build it without ever once triggering the kind of resistance a more heavy-handed approach would have provoked. There was no single moment where an innocent girl became something dark. There was only ever the long, quiet, meticulous process of a master craftsman shaping raw material into precisely the tool he required. One careful decision at a time, across years, until the final result bore almost no resemblance to whatever that lost, half-conscious child on the battlefield at Ruusan might otherwise have grown up to become. Somewhere in an alternate version of the galaxy, one where the Jedi Order found her before Bain did, that same raw potential might have grown into something entirely different, disciplined, powerful, and turned in service of protection rather than domination. Instead, she became something else entirely, and by the time she was old enough to understand what that something else actually was, the question of whether she might have chosen differently had already been answered for her years earlier, by a man who never once gave her the chance to choose at all. By the time her secret training of Cognos was well underway, and Bain's obsession with immortality had pulled him further and further from her side, Zannah had arrived at a kind of quiet, settled clarity about her own path forward, one that mixed the patience she had spent her whole life cultivating with a new, sharper edge of urgency she had not needed to feel before. She understood now that she could not simply wait indefinitely for her master's strength to fade on its own natural timeline, the way the rule of two, in its purest, most idealized form, imagined the transition of power was always supposed to unfold. Bain was searching for a way to remove that timeline from the equation entirely, to make himself permanent, unkillable, eternal. And if he succeeded, everything Zannah had spent her entire life being shaped to eventually claim would simply be taken off the table forever, replaced by an infinite servitude she had never once been prepared, psychologically or otherwise, to accept. She had built herself a secret weapon in Cognos. She had built herself a lifetime of patient, disciplined mastery over the specific, terrifying art of unraveling a mind from the inside. And she understood, with the same cold clarity that had defined every other major decision in her life, that the moment was approaching when all of that preparation would need to be turned, for the first and only time, against the one person who had built her into someone capable of turning it against anyone at all. What she did not yet fully know, and what would only become clear once the confrontation between them finally, inevitably arrived, was exactly how far Bane's search for immortality had actually progressed, or exactly what kind of desperate, dangerous choice a man staring down the end of his own life might be willing to make once he realized his apprentice was no longer content to simply wait in the wings for her turn to come. Two people who loved each other in whatever damaged, conditional way the word applied to either of them, were about to stand across from one another, with the full weight of everything they had built together, bearing down on a single, final confrontation, one that neither of them had ever really believed, on some level, would actually arrive as anything other than an abstract, distant certainty sitting somewhere off in an unspecified future. That future had finally, quietly arrived. And what happened next? On a desolate world called Ambria, far from anywhere the wider galaxy was paying attention, would determine not only which of them survived, but what kind of Sith Order would go on to shape the galaxy's history for the next 1,000 years, all the way down to a boy from Naboo who would one day sit in an office chair on Coruscant, entirely unaware of just how much of his own path had already been carved out for him by a girl named Rain, standing alone in the ashes of a battlefield a very long time before he was ever born. Ambria was not a world anyone would have chosen for a moment of galactic significance. It was remote, harsh, largely forgotten by the Republic, and untouched by the wars that had shaped so much of the galaxy's recent history. A dry, wind-scoured place better suited to hiding secrets than hosting the kind of confrontation that would decide the future of the Sith. That was exactly why Bane had gone there. He had not traveled to Ambria to confront his apprentice. He had traveled there in search of something else entirely, chasing down one final, desperate lead in his search for a way to cheat death. And it was only because Zannah had finally run out of patience waiting for him to return on his own timeline that she followed the trail he had left behind and arrived on that same desolate world herself, no longer willing to simply wait in the wings for whatever conclusion his obsession was eventually going to reach. By the time she found him, something in Bane had visibly changed. And it was not a change that suggested strength. The search for immortality had consumed him in ways that went beyond simple obsession, wearing down his body and his judgment in equal measure, leaving him leaner, more haunted, more prone to the kind of erratic behavior that had never once characterized the calculating, endlessly patient man who had raised her. Whatever he had been chasing on Ambria, whatever ancient secret or forbidden ritual he believed might finally grant him the escape from death he had spent years desperately searching for, it had not gone the way he hoped. He looked, when Zannah finally found him, less like the architect of a 1,000-year dynasty and more like a man running out of road, aware on some level that the thing he feared most was closing in, regardless of how hard he searched for a way around it. And standing across from him, for the first time in their entire relationship, Zannah did not see her master. She saw, with the same cold clarity she brought to every other assessment she had ever made, an opponent, weakened, desperate, and, for the very first time in her life, beatable. What makes the confrontation that followed genuinely difficult to pin down with certainty, even now, is that the surviving accounts of exactly what happened between them on Ambria do not agree on every detail, and that ambiguity is not simply a gap in the historical record. It reflects something true about the nature of what Zannah had actually become by that point in her life. She was, above everything else, a master of illusion, a woman who had spent her entire adulthood learning to make people question whether what they were seeing was actually real. It would be entirely in character and entirely consistent with everything she had ever done. For the final confrontation between her and her master to have been shaped, at least in part, by exactly that same skill, layers of misdirection and manufactured perception folded into the one moment of her life where absolute clarity should, in theory, have mattered more than at any other point in her training. What can be said with confidence is this: the two of them fought, master against apprentice. In the way the rule of two had always known, this moment would eventually arrive. Whether that fight took the form of blades meeting in the open air of Ambria's harsh landscape, or something closer to a battle waged inside the mind, illusion against desperation, patience against fear. And at the end of it, only one of them remained standing in the way that mattered. Darth Bane, the man who had built the entire modern philosophy of the Sith around the inevitability of exactly this outcome, was dead, killed by the apprentice he had spent her entire life shaping specifically to be capable of killing him. There is a particular kind of horror worth sitting with in that outcome, separate from the simple fact of the killing itself. Bane had not been surprised by what happened to him on some fundamental level. He could not have been. He was the one who wrote the law that guaranteed this exact ending, the one who understood more completely than anyone else in the galaxy that raising a powerful, disciplined, patient apprentice meant raising his own eventual executioner, and who did it anyway, deliberately, with total awareness of where the path was leading. And yet knowing something intellectually, understanding a truth in the abstract sense that lets a person build an entire philosophy around it, is not the same as standing in front of that truth made flesh, watching it approach with a blade or a whispered illusion, understanding in the final moments that the child you raised, the person you shaped more completely than anyone has ever shaped another human being, has finally, calmly, without hesitation, decided that your usefulness to her has ended. Whatever affection had existed between them across the years, and there is reason to believe real affection had existed, however twisted and conditional it may have been, none of it changed the outcome. The rule of two did not make exceptions for love. It was, in fact, specifically designed not to. Because Bane had understood, even as he built his own eventual death sentence into the philosophy he created, that any system allowing for exceptions on the basis of sentiment would eventually collapse the same way the old Sith Empire had collapsed, undone by the exact kind of soft, competing loyalties he had spent his entire life trying to engineer out of the dark side forever. Picture the scene itself for a moment, stripped of everything that came before it and everything that would follow after. A wind-scoured, forgotten world, empty of witnesses, empty of anyone who might ever record what actually happened there with any real accuracy. Two figures facing each other across a stretch of barren ground. One of them the architect of an entire philosophy of patience and discipline. The other the living proof of exactly how well that philosophy worked. There was no crowd to watch, no audience to impress, no wider galaxy paying the slightest attention to what was, in the most literal sense imaginable, the single most consequential duel in 1,000 years of Sith history, a confrontation that would determine not simply which of two individuals survived the day, but what kind of Sith Order would eventually go on to shape the fate of an entire republic, and, further down the line than either of them could have possibly imagined, the entire galaxy. Bane had spent his life building toward moments of vast, hidden consequence, unfolding in total obscurity. And it is a strange, bitter kind of symmetry that his own death would become exactly that. A moment of total historical significance, witnessed by no one but the person who caused it, recorded nowhere with any real precision. Exactly the way he had always insisted the Sith should operate. What we do know, pieced together from the fragments that survive, is that Bane did not go quietly, and did not go without first attempting to use every advantage his decades of accumulated knowledge could offer him. He had spent a lifetime mastering the dark side of the Force in all its most dangerous, most forbidden applications, and even weakened, even desperate, even running out of time in his search for a way to escape the death now standing directly in front of him, he remained one of the most formidably trained Sith Lords the galaxy had ever produced. Zannah did not win because her master had become weak enough to be easily defeated. She won because she had been built, deliberately and specifically, to eventually be capable of defeating him, trained across an entire childhood and adolescence in exactly the skills that would make this single confrontation survivable for her and fatal for him. Every lesson in patience, every hour spent mastering illusion and misdirection, every carefully disciplined suppression of the kind of reckless, visible ambition that had doomed so many Sith before the rule of two ever existed. All of it had been building, without either of them ever speaking the truth aloud, toward exactly this moment. Bane had spent years constructing the single most effective weapon he possibly could against the one enemy he always understood would eventually come for him. He simply never fully reckoned, in an emotional sense, with what it would actually feel like to watch that weapon turn and point directly at him. At last, after a lifetime of aiming it everywhere else. There are accounts, fragmentary and difficult to fully verify, suggesting that Bane did not go into that final confrontation entirely unprepared, that his search for immortality had led him somewhere close enough to success that he attempted, in his final moments, something far stranger than simple physical resistance. The suggestion, murky as it remains, is that he tried to use whatever forbidden knowledge he had gathered across his desperate search to transfer his own consciousness directly into his apprentice's body at the moment of his death. An act of total, final possession that would have allowed him to survive the rule of two's inevitable conclusion in the most literal sense imaginable, not by defeating the law he himself had created, but by hijacking the very vessel meant to replace him and continuing to exist inside her, wearing her body, her power, and her legacy as his own permanent escape from the death closing in around him. If that account holds any truth, then the final moments between them were not simply a physical duel, but something closer to the ultimate expression of everything unsettling about their entire relationship distilled into a single, desperate act. A father, faced with his own extinction, attempting to survive by consuming the daughter he had raised specifically to replace him, erasing the very individuality he had spent years cultivating in her, the moment that individuality finally became inconvenient to his own survival. Whether the attempt succeeded, failed entirely, or achieved something in between, that historical record has simply failed to preserve clearly. One fact remains beyond dispute. Whoever or whatever walked away from Ambria afterward carried the name and the title Zannah had spent her entire life being built to eventually claim. She emerged from that confrontation as the new Dark Lord of the Sith, sole master of the Rule of Two, the first apprentice in the new lineage to successfully complete the exact cycle Bane had designed 1,000 years of Sith history to run through, generation after generation, forever. Consider, for a moment, what it must have actually felt like in the immediate aftermath of that killing, standing alone on a windswept, forgotten world with the only family she had ever known lying dead at her feet, and feeling, underneath whatever grief or complicated residual love might have surfaced in that moment, something else entirely. Relief, vindication, the quiet, settling satisfaction of a life's purpose finally, completely fulfilled. Most people, confronted with the death of the person who raised them, even a person as monstrous and manipulative as Bane, would expect to feel something closer to devastation, some fracture in the foundation of their own identity opening up in the wake of that loss. Zannah had been built too completely, too deliberately, for that particular kind of devastation to fully take hold. She had spent her entire life being shaped toward exactly this outcome, trained not simply to accept it but to eventually want it. And so when it finally arrived, what she likely experienced was not the collapse of her world, but its completion. The apprentice becomes the master. The student becomes the teacher. The girl who had no name that mattered, found half-conscious in the ashes of a battlefield, was now, in the fullest and most absolute sense the galaxy had to offer, someone with a name that mattered more than almost any other hidden name in galactic history. Darth Zannah, Dark Lord of the Sith, second in the unbroken lineage Bane had died to create, and the very first proof that his entire philosophy actually worked exactly the way he had promised it would. What she did in the years immediately following Bane's death reveals almost as much about her character as everything that came before it. A lesser Sith, freed for the first time from the structure and discipline of a master's constant oversight, might have rushed immediately towards some grand, reckless display of power, eager to prove to the wider galaxy, or perhaps simply to herself, exactly how much stronger she had become now that no one stood above her any longer. Zannah did nothing of the sort. She continued the exact same patient, invisible strategy Bane had spent his life building, because she understood, in a way that went beyond simple obedience to a dead man's teachings, that the strategy itself had never actually been about Bane's particular preferences or personality. It was a genuinely sound approach to survival and eventual dominance for a Sith Order that had, within living memory, been annihilated almost entirely by the opposite strategy, by openness, by ambition too loud and too visible to survive. Contact with a unified, disciplined enemy. She kept the Sith hidden. She kept their existence a secret from a Jedi Order and a Republic that remained. Across the years of her reign, entirely convinced that the Sith had died on Ruusan and never risen again. And she began, formally now, the process of shaping her own successor. bringing Cognos fully into the light of her own attention rather than the shadowed beast's secret training that had defined their relationship while Bane was still alive, finally bestowing on her the full weight of the title she had been quietly promised years earlier, on the condition, understood by both of them without needing to be spoken aloud, that everything which followed would eventually, inevitably, end exactly the way Zannah's own relationship with Bane had ended. It is worth pausing here to examine exactly what kind of master Zannah became, because the contrast with Bane's approach to raising her reveals something important about how deeply her own upbringing had shaped her understanding of power, loyalty, and control. Bane had built his relationship with Zannah on a foundation of genuine, if deeply conditional, and ultimately doomed, affection. He had shared knowledge with her openly across years of patient instruction, allowing her to absorb not just techniques, but the underlying philosophy that gave those techniques their true power. Zannah's approach to Cognos, by most surviving accounts, ran along a somewhat different path. More guarded, more transactional, built less around the slow cultivation of trust, and more around the disciplined, calculated management of a relationship. Both of them understood, from the very beginning, was built on borrowed time. Perhaps this was simply a difference in personality between the two women. Perhaps it reflects something Zannah had learned from watching her own master's final months, the way his obsession with immortality had ultimately curdled whatever genuine warmth had once existed between them into something closer to suspicion and self-preservation. Whatever the reason, the relationship between Zannah and Cognos never seemed to carry the same complicated emotional weight that had defined Zannah's own childhood under Bane's care. And Cognos, for her part, would go on to become perhaps the most rigid, most absolute believer in the rule of two that the entire lineage ever produced. A woman whose devotion to the doctrine outstripped even Bane's own commitment to it, to the point where she would eventually prove willing to move against her own apprentice the instant he suggested even the smallest deviation from the philosophy she had inherited from Zannah, and treated, from that point forward, as something closer to sacred, unquestionable law. There is something genuinely unsettling in tracing that particular thread forward, watching how each generation in this lineage absorbed and then amplified certain aspects of what came before it while quietly discarding others. Bane built the rule of two out of cold strategic necessity, but he never fully escaped the pull of sentiment, the genuine affection that complicated his relationship with Zannah right up until the moment that affection cost him his life. Zannah inherited the strategy but seemed to strip away much of the sentiment that had defined her master's version of it, raising Cognos with a colder, more disciplined hand than the one that had raised her. And Cognos, inheriting the doctrine from a master who had already hardened it considerably from its original form, hardened it further still, transforming what had begun as a pragmatic solution to a specific historical problem into something closer to an inflexible, zealous religion, one she would enforce with a rigidity that occasionally exceeded even what the doctrine itself actually required. Watch that pattern closely, and you can see, generations before Palpatine ever sat in a chancellor's office on Coruscant, the exact mechanism that would eventually produce a Sith Order capable of the kind of total, ruthless, patient manipulation that finally succeeded in bringing down the Jedi and the Republic both, each master shaping an apprentice slightly colder, slightly more disciplined, slightly less burdened by the kind of sentiment that had doomed every previous version of the Sith. refining the lineage, the same way Bane had always envisioned it being refined, generation after generation, until whatever emerged at the far end of that thousand-year chain would bear almost no resemblance to the flawed, fractious, emotionally volatile Sith Empire that had destroyed itself on Ruusan in the first place. Zannah's own reign as Dark Lord of the Sith stretched on for years afterward, largely hidden from the wider galaxy the same way Bane's had been, and largely absent from the kind of detailed historical record that survives for more prominent figures in Sith history. That absence is not a flaw in how her story has been preserved. It is, in the truest sense, a testament to exactly how completely she succeeded at the one thing her entire life had been built to accomplish: a Sith Lord who leaves behind detailed records, who becomes the subject of songs or histories or widely circulated legend, is a Sith Lord who failed, on some fundamental level, at the core discipline Bane had built the modern Sith Order around. Visibility was vulnerability. Being known was being hunted. Zannah understood that lesson more completely than almost any Sith who followed her. And so her years as Master passed largely in silence, a quiet, patient continuation of the exact strategy that had kept the Sith alive and undetected. Since the moment Bane first knelt beside a half-conscious child in the ashes of Ruusan and decided she was worth the investment of an entire philosophy, built around patience, what eventually happened to Zannah herself remains one of the more genuinely unresolved mysteries in this entire lineage, and the uncertainty surrounding her own death carries its own particular kind of unsettling resonance, given everything her life had been built around. Unlike Bane, whose final confrontation on Ambria has at least been preserved, however imperfectly, in the surviving record, no clear account exists of exactly when, where, or how Zannah's own reign as Dark Lord of the Sith finally came to an end. What can be inferred, based on the simple, unbreakable logic of the Rule of Two itself, is that it must have ended the same way every master's reign in this lineage was always destined to end. Cognos, the apprentice Zannah had cultivated in secret and then formally claimed and trained across the years of her own mastery, eventually grew strong enough, patient enough, and hungry enough to do to Zannah exactly what Zannah had once done to Bane. The specifics of that confrontation have simply been lost to history, swallowed by the same discipline of secrecy that had defined and protected the Sith across the entire era, a discipline so effective that even the death of the Dark Lord who helped perfect it left behind almost no trace for future generations to examine. It is worth comparing her, briefly, to some of the other names that tend to come up when people talk about the most frightening figures the dark side ever produced, because the comparison sharpens exactly what makes Zannah's particular brand of horror so distinct. Darth Vitiate, centuries earlier, terrified the galaxy through raw, staggering scale. A Sith Lord whose ambitions stretched toward devouring the life force of an entire planet at once, whose very existence threatened annihilation on a scope most beings could barely comprehend. That is a terror built from magnitude, from the sheer, overwhelming size of the threat involved. Darth Plagueis, centuries after Zannah, would eventually terrify people through a different mechanism entirely: a cold, clinical mastery over the building blocks of life itself, manipulating midichlorians with the detached precision of a scientist rather than the passion of a warrior, a terror built from the unsettling calm of someone who saw living beings as raw material to be engineered rather than people to be respected. Both of those approaches to terror share something in common that Zannah's approach conspicuously lacks. They are, in their own ways, still visible, still identifiable as danger, even if the scale or the coldness involved makes that danger difficult to fully process. A planet being drained of its life force is a horror you can point to. A Sith Lord discussing the manipulation of life at a cellular level is a horror you can name, even if naming it does not make it any less disturbing. Zannah's terror refuses that kind of clarity entirely. And that refusal is precisely what makes her, in certain respects, more difficult to sit with than either of those far more famous, far more openly destructive figures. You cannot point to a planet she drained. You cannot point to a grand, visible atrocity that defines her the way the Death Star defines the darkest ambitions of the Empire she helped make possible, generations before it ever existed. What you can point to, instead, is a method, a philosophy of power built entirely around invisibility, around convincing a target that the danger threatening them exists only inside their own compromised mind, around achieving total domination over another person's reality without ever needing to announce your own presence at all. That is a fundamentally harder kind of terror to defend against, because there is no clear signal warning you that you are in danger until the danger has already succeeded in reshaping what you believe to be true. A planet drained of its life force at least offers the terrible mercy of a clear, identifiable villain. A mind slowly, patiently unraveled by illusion offers no such mercy, because by the time the damage is complete, the victim often cannot even reliably identify what happened to them, let alone who was responsible for doing it. There is also something worth examining in how this particular kind of terror maps onto broader patterns of manipulation and control that extend well beyond the specific context of the Force or the dark side altogether. Every method Zannah used against Darth, the patient cultivation of false intimacy, the careful identification and exploitation of suppressed private wants, the gradual undermining of a target's confidence in their own perception until they become entirely dependent on the manipulator's version of reality. Mirrors, in an uncomfortably precise way, patterns of psychological abuse and coercive control that exist far outside the realm of fiction. Patterns that do not require access to the dark side of the Force at all. Only patience, calculation, and a willingness to treat another person's mind as a problem to be solved rather than a self to be respected. That resonance is likely not accidental. The most effective fictional villains tend to draw their power from something recognizable, some exaggerated but fundamentally true reflection of dangers that already exist in the world beyond the story itself. And Zannah's particular brand of horror draws from exactly that well. She is frightening not simply because she can conjure illusions with the Force, but because the underlying mechanism of what she does, the slow, deliberate erosion of a person's trust in their own mind, is something that requires no supernatural ability to recognize as genuinely, viscerally dangerous. There is something quietly, almost poetically unsettling in that absence, worth sitting with before this story moves any further forward. Zannah spent her entire life mastering illusion, mastering the art of making people question whether what they perceived was actually real, mastering the discipline of remaining hidden and unknown, even while wielding enormous, quiet influence over the events unfolding around her. And in the end, Her own death disappeared into exactly the same kind of obscurity she had spent, her whole existence cultivating for herself and for the Sith Order she had helped shape. She does not get a dramatic final confrontation preserved in vivid detail the way Bane's death does. She simply vanishes from the record, the same way she had largely vanished from the galaxy's awareness throughout her entire reign, leaving behind only the certainty that her apprentice eventually replaced her, and the far more unsettling implications sitting underneath that certainty. The woman who had once manufactured Set Hearth's slow, complete psychological unraveling, who had once looked at her own dying master and felt something closer to satisfaction than grief, who had built her entire life around the total, disciplined mastery of fear and perception, met her own end in a way so quiet, so completely unrecorded, that the details of it are simply gone, lost to exactly the same darkness she had spent her whole life learning to wield against everyone else. Cognos's own reign as Dark Lord of the Sith, once it finally arrived, would go on to demonstrate exactly how far the doctrine Zannah had helped harden could be pushed before it started to reveal its own internal cracks. Where Zannah had bent the rule of two just slightly, quietly cultivating a secret apprentice ahead of schedule in violation of the letter of the law, while still honoring what she likely understood to be its underlying spirit, Cognos allowed for no such flexibility at all. She became, by most accounts that survive from this era, the single most rigid, most absolute enforcer the doctrine ever produced, treating even the smallest proposed deviation from Bane's original vision as something bordering on heresy. This rigidity would eventually bring her into direct conflict with her own apprentice, a Sith Lord who, according to fragments preserved from this period, proposed an alternative method for eventually training a successor of his own, some adjustment to the traditional approach that he believed might improve upon the system he had inherited. Cognos's response to that proposal was not debate, and it was not patient consideration of whether the suggestion had merit. It was violence, swift and absolute, an attempt to eliminate her own apprentice the moment he dared to suggest that Bane's original design, refined and hardened across generations of masters before her, might still have room left for improvement. There is something worth pausing on in that particular escalation, because it illustrates a pattern that would recur in various forms throughout the entire 1,000-year history of this lineage, and it traces directly back to choices Zannah herself made during her own reign. A system built around total secrecy, total discipline, and the complete, unquestioning internalization of doctrine passed down from master to apprentice does not simply preserve itself unchanged across generations. It tends, instead, to compound whatever tendencies exist within it, each master reinforcing and often intensifying whatever their own predecessor taught them, because there are no external checks left in the system capable of moderating that drift. Bane created the doctrine out of necessity, understanding it as a strategic solution to a specific historical failure. Zannah inherited that doctrine, and while she quietly bent certain aspects of it to serve her own survival, never seemed to question its fundamental legitimacy in any way that survives in the historical record. Cognos inherited it from a master who had already treated it as close to inviolable and pushed that inviolability even further, until the doctrine itself had effectively become more sacred to her than the actual survival and success of the individual apprentices she was meant to be cultivating. That is precisely how rigid ideological systems tend to calcify over time, not through any single dramatic corruption, but through a slow, generational accumulation of unquestioning devotion. Each master, a little less willing than the last, to imagine that the framework they inherited might ever need to bend or adapt to changing circumstances. It is worth returning one final time to the specific nature of the terror Zannah pioneered, because it deserves to be understood as something more than simply one Sith Lord's personal specialty among many equally valid options. Fear built from illusion, from the deliberate, patient corruption of a target's perception of reality, operates on a fundamentally different psychological register than fear built from physical threat, and understanding that difference helps explain why her particular legacy echoes so persistently through everything that followed her in this lineage. Physical threat, however severe, leaves the core structure of a person's identity largely intact. You can be terrified of a blade at your throat, and still, underneath that terror, know exactly who you are, what you believe, and what is actually happening to you in that moment. The fear Zannah specialized in attacks that underlying structure directly. It does not simply frighten a person. It destabilizes their capacity to trust their own experience of reality. And once that capacity has been sufficiently undermined, the resulting fear becomes self-sustaining in a way physical intimidation never quite manages to achieve. Because the target can no longer fully trust their own judgment about when the danger has actually passed. Set Darth likely carried some version of that instability with him for the remainder of whatever life he had left after Zannah finished with him, a permanent, low-grade uncertainty about the reliability of his own senses that no amount of time or distance from her would have been able to fully erase. That is the particular cruelty of the weapon she mastered. It does not simply hurt its target in the moment. It leaves behind a wound that continues quietly corroding the target's sense of self long after the original attack has ended. A wound most victims never even fully realize they are carrying, because the entire point of the attack was to make sure they could never be completely certain of anything again, including the fact that they had been attacked at all. There is one more thread worth pulling on before this story reaches its final resting point, because it touches on something that echoes forward through the entire remainder of Sith history in a way that is easy to overlook if you focus only on the immediate details of Zannah's own life. Consider, for a moment, exactly how young she was when the process of shaping her actually began. Most accounts suggest she was still a child, barely old enough to have formed any stable sense of who she was or what she wanted from her own life, when Bane found her in the wreckage of Ruusan and began the long process of building her into his successor. That timing matters enormously, because it means the entire architecture of her adult identity, her values, her understanding of loyalty, her relationship to fear and to power and to the people around her, was constructed almost entirely during the exact developmental window when a person is most vulnerable to precisely that kind of shaping. An adult recruited into the Sith, someone who had already lived enough of their own life to develop an independent sense of self before encountering Bane's influence, would have brought some measure of resistance into that relationship, some prior framework of values against which Bane's teachings could be measured, tested, and potentially rejected. Zannah had no such framework. She had nothing to measure Bane's teachings against, because Bane's teachings were, in the most literal sense, the only foundation her entire adult identity was ever built upon. There was no earlier version of her to compare the finished product against, no baseline of who she might have become under different circumstances, because the circumstances she actually experienced arrived early enough to consume the entire process of becoming a person in the first place. This is worth sitting with a little longer, because it reframes the entire question of culpability in a way that most retellings of her story tend to skip past far too quickly. It would be simple, and in some ways more comfortable, to think of Zannah purely as a villain, a fully formed monster who simply happened to have a tragic backstory attached to her origins. But tragedy implies a path not taken, a version of events where things could have gone differently if only certain choices had been made differently along the way. And it is genuinely difficult to locate the moment in Zannah's life where a different choice was actually available to her. She did not choose to be orphaned on a battlefield. She did not choose the man who found her, or the philosophy he decided to build her around, or the total isolation that surrounded her formative years, cutting off any competing influence that might have offered her a different way of understanding the world. Every major fork in the road that shaped who she eventually became was a fork Bane-controlled, not a fork she navigated with any genuine agency of her own. By the time she reached an age where something resembling independent choice might have theoretically become possible, the tools she would have needed to exercise that choice, an independent moral framework, a foundation of values not entirely constructed by the very person whose influence she might have wanted to resist, simply were not available to her. They had never been allowed to develop in the first place. None of this excuses what she eventually did: to set Darth, to Bane himself, to whatever unknown targets across her own reign, as Dark Lord left behind no trace in the surviving historical record at all. The people she manipulated and destroyed do not become less harmed by understanding the circumstances that produced the person who harmed them. But there is a particular, quieter horror in recognizing that the most complete, most successful weapon the early Rule of Two ever produced was not built from some innate, irredeemable cruelty present in her from birth, but was instead manufactured piece by piece, choice by choice, by an adult who identified a vulnerable child and spent years deliberately closing off every alternative path her life might otherwise have taken. That is not a story about a monster who happened to also have a difficult childhood. That is a story about how monsters are frequently made, deliberately, by people who understand exactly what they are doing and choose to do it anyway because the result serves their own purposes. Bane did not stumble into raising a dangerous apprentice. He engineered one with total intention from the earliest possible moment available to him. And the fact that his creation eventually turned around and killed him does not soften the horror of what he did to a small, orphaned girl who never had the chance to become anyone else. Trace the lineage forward from that point, generation after hidden generation, and the pattern Zannah helped establish continues unbroken across the centuries that follow. Cognos trains an apprentice of her own, who eventually replaces her, who trains another, and another, each transition happening in the same total secrecy, each master shaping an apprentice slightly further along the same cold, disciplined trajectory that Zannah had helped push the lineage toward from its very earliest days. Names blur and disappear across those centuries, most of them lost entirely to a historical record that was never meant to preserve them in the first place, until eventually, roughly 1,000 years after Bane first knelt beside a half-conscious child on a smoking battlefield, the lineage arrives at a Sith Lord named Darth Plagueis, a master obsessed, in his own way, with exactly the same fear that had once consumed Bane in his final years. The fear of death, the desperate hunger for a way to escape the very law of succession Bane had built the entire Sith Order around in the first place. Plagueis would pursue that obsession further than Bane ever managed to, delving into the manipulation of life itself at the most fundamental level, and would eventually train an apprentice of his own, a young senator from Naboo who would take the name Darth Sidious, and who would finally, after 1,000 years of patient, hidden refinement stretching all the way back to a girl named Rain standing alone in the wreckage of Ruusan, bring the entire strategy Bane had designed to its ultimate, catastrophic conclusion, striking at the Jedi Order and the Republic, both from a position of total invisibility, exactly the way Bane had always envisioned it should eventually happen. It is worth ending here, on this particular thought, because it captures something genuinely disquieting about Zannah's true legacy, one that goes far beyond the specific details of her own life and death. She is often remembered, when she is remembered at all, outside of dedicated study of this era, as a footnote in Bane's story, the apprentice who killed him and continued his work, a single link in a very long chain stretching between the founding of the Rule of Two and the eventual rise of the Galactic Empire. But look more closely at what she actually contributed to that chain beyond simply keeping it intact. She was the first proof that the Rule of Two actually worked. She was the one who demonstrated, in practice rather than theory, that an apprentice could be raised from nothing, shaped completely and totally by a single controlling influence, and turned into something capable of executing every single demand the philosophy required of her, including the eventual, inevitable murder of the only person who had ever loved her. Every Sith who followed in that lineage, all the way down to Sidious himself, existed because Zannah proved the system worked, because she absorbed everything Bane built into her, and then carried it forward, refined it, hardened it, and passed it along to a successor of her own, who would do the exact same thing in turn. Think about the sheer distance covered by that single act of proof. A philosophy is not truly a philosophy until someone demonstrates it can actually survive contact with reality, and reality, for a doctrine as brutal and self-destructive on its surface as the Rule of Two, offered exactly one true test. Would the apprentice actually do it? Would the person raised specifically to eventually kill their master, when the moment finally arrived, actually be capable of following through? Or would some flicker of hesitation, some remnant of ordinary human attachment, cause the entire system to collapse the first time it was actually asked to function as designed? Every single subsequent generation of this lineage, every master who would ever again pour years of their life into shaping a successor they knew was being built specifically to end them, existed only because Zannah answered that question definitively, on a forgotten world, with no hesitation anyone has ever recorded. She did not simply continue Bane's work. She validated the entire premise his work was built upon, and in doing so, she made every subsequent generation of Sith possible, all the way down to the moment, 1,000 years later, when a senator from Naboo would stand in a Senate chamber and begin quietly, patiently executing the final phase of a strategy that had needed exactly this kind of proof, established a millennium earlier by a girl with no name that mattered. In order to ever become thinkable at all, the terror she specialized in during her own lifetime, the illusions, the psychological unraveling, the slow, patient corruption of a target's grip on reality, was always, in the end, only ever a smaller reflection of the larger terror she represented simply by existing at all. She was proof that a person could be built deliberately and completely into exactly what someone else needed them to become, with no resistance left inside them by the time the process was finished, no independent self remaining to object to any of it. That is a different category of frightening than anything a lightsaber or a bolt of lightning can offer, because it does not threaten a single body in a single moment. It threatens the very idea that identity is something stable, something a person can rely on to remain their own across a lifetime, uncorrupted by whoever happens to hold the most influence over their formative years. Zannah is the proof that this assumption is not, in fact, guaranteed. Given enough time, enough isolation, and enough patience on the part of whoever is doing the shaping, a person can be constructed almost entirely from the outside, right down to the values they believe are most authentically their own, right down to the specific, monstrous acts they will eventually carry out without a flicker of the resistance an outside observer might assume any decent person would naturally feel. And once you understand that about her, once you sit with the full implication of a mind shaped that thoroughly, that patiently, by a single controlling influence from the earliest years of childhood onward, it becomes difficult to think of anything else in this 1,000-year story quite as quietly, thoroughly terrifying as the girl who was found in the ashes of one apocalypse and who grew up to help engineer the beginning of another one, without ever once, as far as the historical record shows, stopping to ask herself whether any of it could have gone any other way. Bane built the fear that Sith history would repeat itself the way it always had before, collapsing under the weight of its own ambition and infighting. Zannah answered that fear so completely, so thoroughly, that the very system built to prevent one kind of collapse ended up manufacturing something arguably far more disturbing in its place. A lineage of masters and apprentices bound together not by loyalty or belief, but by the cold, patient certainty that each of them was raising the exact instrument of their own eventual death, and doing it anyway, generation after generation. Because a girl named Rain once proved, on a forgotten world called Ambria, that when the moment finally came, the apprentice would always, without fail, be ready. There is one final, quietly haunting detail worth leaving this story on, because it suggests that even death did not fully sever the connection between master and apprentice the way the rule of two was designed to demand. Long after Ambria, long after Zannah herself had vanished from the historical record, in whatever quiet, unrecorded way eventually claimed her, a spectral presence identified as Darth Bane appeared in the galaxy once more, manifesting as a kind of lingering echo of the dark side, encountered by a Jedi apprentice under circumstances that had nothing directly to do with Zannah at all. In that encounter, the spectre spoke of an apprentice, referencing, however obliquely, the woman he had raised and who had ultimately killed him. Whether that manifestation represented some genuine fragment of Bane's consciousness, surviving in some diminished, spectral form despite the failure of whatever ritual he attempted on Ambria, or whether it represented something closer to a powerful, lingering dark side echo shaped by the sheer intensity of what had happened between them, the fact remains unsettling either way. Even in death, even after his own philosophy demanded his execution at the hands of the very person he raised for that exact purpose, some trace of Bane lingered in the galaxy long enough to be encountered by others, still speaking of her, still defined, even as a ghost, by the relationship that had shaped the entire remainder of Sith history. It raises an uncomfortable question that the historical record has never definitively answered. Did Zannah ever sense that lingering presence herself, at any point during her own reign as master? Did some part of her ever wonder whether the man she killed had truly, fully left the galaxy behind, or whether some fragment of him remained, watching, waiting, still calculating, the same way he had calculated everything else across the entire span of her childhood and training? The Sith built an entire philosophy around the promise that killing your master finally, completely freed you to become your own person, unburdened by the influence that shaped you. Bane's lingering echo suggests that promise may never have been entirely true, that the architecture built into a person during their most formative years does not simply vanish the moment its architect dies, that some trace of the hand that shaped you remains embedded in the structure long after the builder himself is gone. Return, for a final moment, to where this story began, to the idea that fear does not need to raise its voice to be effective, that the most dangerous version of the Sith was never the one screaming through a burning battlefield, but the one standing quietly at its edge, patient, watching, already calculating what came next. That is who Zannah was. From the very first moment Bane knelt beside her in the ashes of Ruusan, to the very last, unrecorded moment of her own reign as Dark Lord of the Sith, to whatever quiet, hidden death eventually claimed her at the hands of an apprentice she had built for exactly that purpose. She never needed the galaxy to know her name in order to shape its future. She never needed spectacle or armies or grand declarations of power in order to become one of the most consequential figures in the entire 1,000-year history of the Sith. She needed only patience and discipline and a mastery over fear so complete that her victims often never even realized until it was far too late that anything had been done to them at all. That is the specific, quiet horror of Darth Zannah. And it is a horror that outlived her by 1,000 years, embedded so deeply into the strategy she helped prove could work that it eventually reached all the way to the fall of the Republic itself, carried forward the entire distance by a system she never once, as far as anyone has ever been able to determine, questioned, resented, or wished away. Somewhere in that 1,000-year distance between a girl named Rain and a senator named Sidious, the galaxy went on living its ordinary life, almost entirely unaware of how much of its future had already been decided on a forgotten battlefield and a forgotten desert world. Decided by choices made in total secrecy, by a master who understood that the Sith could never again afford to be seen, and an apprentice who understood, perhaps even more completely than her master ever did, exactly what it meant to become invisible on purpose. Every Jedi who trained during those centuries, every senator who debated policy in the halls of the Republic, every ordinary being who lived and died believing the Sith had ended on Ruusan, existed inside a galaxy that Zannah had already, quietly, permanently altered, simply by proving that the darkest, most patient version of the Sith Order could actually survive, generation after generation, hidden in plain sight. That is the true shape of the terror she represents. Not a monster you can see coming, not a threat you can prepare for. A silence that has already reshaped everything around you, long before you ever have any reason to suspect it exists at all. Perhaps that is the most fitting way to leave her story. Unresolved in the same way her own life ultimately went unresolved by the historical record. A shape glimpsed only at its edges, felt more than seen, understood only through its consequences rather than through any clear, direct accounting of who she truly was underneath all of it. She was a child who should have become a Jedi, and instead became something the Jedi never even knew to look for. She was an apprentice who should have feared her master, and instead became patient enough to outlast him. She was a master who should have craved recognition, and instead disappeared so completely that her own death left behind no trace at all. Every part of her existence ran counter to what the galaxy expected a figure of her significance to look like. And that, in the end, may be the truest measure of exactly how dangerous she really was. The Sith who changes history is not always the one remembered loudest. Sometimes it is the one no one ever thought to remember at all. Quietly, patiently, terrifyingly certain the entire time that being forgotten was always the plan.